welcome to this this episode of Beat Teacher Burnout. I'm so excited today because we've got Billy Clark with us, who has been a teacher for many years, and he's going to tell us a little bit about his story, but from a slightly philosophical perspective, because that is his area of expertise. So before we go any further, Billy, hello, it's really great to have you here. And
good morning. Thank you for inviting me on.
Oh, you're welcome. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about you?
Yes, of course. Yeah. So my name is Billy, and I've been a teacher of religious education and philosophy for around 8 years. And then following that, I became a life coach operating within schools for a further 2 years. So I know the education system pretty thoroughly across a range of schools. And I know that sort of move from being a teacher to being a coach might seem like a bit of a strange little venture. And that very much came about during the pandemic, where a lot of the students that I was teaching online, naturally I was speaking to them at home just to make sure that they were okay and that they were dealing with such a confusing time for them, essentially. And then that turned into a lot of conversations with parents, as well as with staff members, as well as those students. And people just assumed that because I was a philosophy teacher, that I suddenly had all the life advice for every possible situation. And that just separated out a little part of my head of, oh, what happens if this is a viable path? What happens if you can actually study to do something like this? Because in my head, you could either be a teacher or a therapist or a counselor. I didn't realize there was something called coaching. So that's been the story of the past couple of years, where I've gone down much more of that route than just being purely in the classroom.
And did you find when you were helping the staff that you were working with and your colleagues, really, what were the biggest issues you were finding that they were having?
Yeah, so they've evolved over time, definitely, and a lot of them are context dependent, but there's a huge problem, I would say, in schools around the idea of burnout, around being overwhelmed, around being confused about who you are and what your future is within the school. There's always the debate of, do I stay in this school? Do I go to a different one? Do I go for a promotion? Do I not? Am I up to taking the responsibility if I'm successful? And I suppose it summarizes down to just, there's a lot of confusion. And then if you introduce the fact that people are then wanting to start families, how are they going to be able to manage all of this, not just financially, but also at a personal angle with a big shift outside of school? So a lot of it just comes down to, I'm feeling really confused about so many areas. What am I supposed to do about it? That's very much the overarching summary of it all.
That's really interesting. We might talk about that a little bit later, if people just don't know where to go with this and how to get help, I suppose, but also how to look at the decisions they've got and what sits well with them. Yeah. Why don't you tell us, Billy, about your experience of overwhelm or burnout? I don't know how you would describe it. Tell us a bit about that for you.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question because I'm happy to use the word burnout, because I didn't even realize that I was burnt out when I was burnt out. And that's precisely the problem, I think, in my head, where I was working at that school for quite a long time, around 6 years at that particular point. And just something had subtly shifted where the amount of work I was expected to do outside of work, just to be able to keep up with the marking expectations, as well as the extra meetings, as well as even just like the commute and the travel anyway. And what had happened is, slowly over time, I'd become a bit more like a shell who I was, a bit more like a dampened version. And I didn't even realize that. It took my girlfriend to say, like, you're speaking in a much more monotone way than you normally do. That sounds really judgmental, like in a nice way, just saying like your energy is shifted. And noticing as well the fact that I used to have a lot of energy to go to the gym and to go running, and that I don't have that spark to want to do that anymore. And just my entire like bodily demeanor completely shifting to be essentially saying like, what's the point in all this? I'm just living to work and that's all. And that was really difficult because I was so engrossed in it and so focused on the work that needed to be done. I didn't even realize like who I was, and that's going to have a massive impact. If I'm feeling like that at home and then turning up into the classroom, like the students are going to see that version of me or a version of me which is already exhausted, and then trying to put on a show which is making me even more tired in the long run. And then it becomes this really vicious spiral of, well, that's where overwhelm turns into burnout. It's when you don't even realize that you're caught in that spiral up until it gets a bit too much. And yeah, that was how I realized after quite a long time. And it was quite a vulnerable moment for me as well, realizing that maybe I'm not this immortal, impenetrable, perfect teacher stood in front of the classroom. I've actually got like really limited resources, and they're being stretched to the limit here. They're being really pushed. And maybe what's being asked of me is more than I've actually got available. And that takes like a raw level of honesty to be able to
Wow.
accept that in yourself.
Oh my goodness. I your vulnerability is really having an impact on me, and I can imagine for teachers listening to this who feel a little bit like that, they're just thinking, yeah, that's me. And can you pinpoint any of the reasons you think you got to that point? What is it about the job, or for you, what was it that pushed you into that place?
There's definitely a question around boundaries, I think, with this, where early on in my teaching career, there was, as with a lot of people, especially because I'd always dreamed of being a teacher. So there was an enormous amount of excitement, and I loved being in the classroom. Then I loved going home to be able to plan the lessons, because I was thinking, I can't wait to actually teach this and deliver that. And for the first 1 or 2 years, you can survive off that level of enthusiasm, and that's great. But then you realize a few years in, actually, I've got to make this sustainable in the long term. So then all of a sudden, that you've got to be able to sort of shift around like the boundaries and to be able to like actually honor them in yourself as well. And that can lead to making some quite difficult decisions. And something for me was, I was naturally drifting towards decisions that were comfortable in the short term, but that weren't good for me in the long term. I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later on in terms of like what that practically looked like. But really sort of the difficulty with me regarding burnout was that my life had essentially revolved around my role and my identity as just a teacher, and that is all. So suddenly, rather than just being in the classroom where I was a teacher, I was suddenly going home and thinking, okay, I'm a teacher. What are some things I can do and can't do? And that affected a lot of areas where even just going to the gym, I'd be thinking, I might see a student. A student cannot see me in anything less than like looking good in formal wear. So I can't go to the like gym walking there in a tracksuit or just in like jogging bottoms or anything else like that. So then even just the idea of going to the gym, which should be a healthy like and motivated thing, suddenly I was thinking, right, well, I don't want to go just in case I see somebody, because this would affect my role as a teacher and how they might see me. And that affected then like what I was saying. It affected the music I was listening to. It affected things that it shouldn't have affected. And that's only obvious now looking back, that actually I was dampening down my personality to fit a role generically rather than bringing myself into the role, which is what made it dynamic in the first place. You didn't just have a teacher, you had me specifically as the teacher. And what makes the next lesson is amazing is that you've got someone else who is energetically themselves, who is also a teacher. And that's where I think a lot of teaching nowadays is struggling, where there's no emphasis on who the person is at the front of the room. All the emphasis is just on the technique and what you should and shouldn't be doing to be able to hit certain grade boundaries and certain outstanding or good performance indicators, rather than it being who is the person stood at the front of the classroom, because that's inseparable from the teaching profession.
Wow. Because so many of us as teachers, we go in because we're passionate about it, and it sort of feels like a vocation, doesn't it? But actually, what you're saying is that because of the nature of the role now, especially, it sort of takes over you, and that passion and that excitement and that creativity actually is squashed out, and it's almost like you become a bit more robotic, and it's not you, and you're not then being the best teacher you could possibly be. Oh my goodness, so. Can I ask, one of the things that a lot of teachers say to me is that they feel they can't say no. And so that leads a lot to the overwhelm. Did you have that?
I did. And again, I think this comes back around to the idea of boundaries. There was a lot of times where, And again, I don't want this to come across in any way as blaming any particular school, any particular head of department, any line manager, any senior leadership. It's nothing like that, because the pressure is just constant for everybody in a school. So I'm fully aware that pressure comes from essentially above and then gets pushed down. But the people at the top of the school, like the head teachers, equally have an enormous amount of pressure anyway. So like I say, I just want to qualify this, that I'm not throwing anybody under the bus.
Yeah.
But with a lot of this, there's this subtle implied conversation of, I'm going to ask you to do something, and the expectation is that you're going to say yes. Like, there seems to be in a lot of my cases where you couldn't genuinely say no. And even if you offered an alternative, it wouldn't be in line with what was actually being asked for in the first place. So that made it a really, really difficult point where if somebody says, oh, can you just get these marks by Monday instead of by Wednesday? Well, you can't really say no, because the feedback lesson is going to be done on the Monday. But if you're being asked that on the Thursday or the Friday, the only available time to do something like that is the Saturday and the Sunday, which is non-teaching time. That is your time off. But if there's going to be an agreement where everyone else in the department says, yes, I can get that done, suddenly then falls onto me as like, can I be confident enough here to say no and overrule an entire department? Because that's going to start a whole series of other conversations. And if someone is in the mindset of, I want to get a promotion down the line, you've got to be seen to be the person who not only says yes to everything, but also follows through on that and is good at doing that as well. So you've got this really difficult situation where you have to be all things to all people at all times, and that can only lead to burnout. So there needs to be clear boundaries put in place, and to be able to do that, if you're going to be able to say no, you have to be able to like genuinely negotiate from your position, in the sense of saying, no, I can't do that. Here's what I can do as an alternative. And also, here's the reasons why I can't do this. It's going to affect my family. It's going to affect my fitness. It's going to affect whatever else it might be that's important to you. And actually making that really clear that my life isn't teaching as the number one above all else priority, but it fits in as other important priorities. Not saying that it shouldn't be like number 2, number 3. It's not saying that it needs to be all the way down at number 10, but just that if you've got young children and you're a teacher, there's going to be a clash in between those two priorities. And sometimes teaching will win, and sometimes it won't. And that doesn't make you a bad teacher, just because sometimes you prioritize your family. So, yeah, if there's going to be this idea of being able to say no, I think as long as you can legitimately negotiate why you are saying no, that's important. And having the confidence that you're allowed to as well, despite the environment maybe suggesting that you can't. Just bringing it all back in on yourself.
Wow. I mean, there's so much in that. And I'm hoping leaders can hear some of that, to be able to be approachable to their staff and almost give permission to their staff to say, you know, if you're feeling overwhelmed and you can't do this, please come and talk to me about it. Don't sit and work all weekend at the expense of your children, but actually let's talk about a bit of give and take maybe. But that requires a trust and a respect in the relationships in the school, doesn't it? And I'm not sure all schools, some certainly have that. I've worked in places that do, but I've also worked in places that don't.
Exactly. And I've been very, very thankful about the fact that the schools that I've worked in, there has been a lot of trust, and that's been lovely. It's meant that when those moments occur, it's because they're out of the usual. That's why those moments stand out, because I'm used to 4 or 5 days being like safe, happy, like a lovely place to be. So then when that one day turns up, or when that one moment turns up, it stands out above the rest. But then if you link a few of those together, suddenly you can start to come to work then and have this sort of chronic stress and this chronic tension, which you hold physically in your body. And that's going to affect how you appear with it all. So underneath all of that trust and all that safety, there's got to be like a psychological safety that underpins it all. As, is this an environment where I can genuinely, legitimately turn up as myself rather than just having to mask? And if there's anybody in senior leadership listening to something like this, the answer isn't always a yes, no. There's always going to be a scale of it all. So in that case, it's going to be a how can I make the environment even more welcoming for our staff, and also for you as senior leadership? because you've got a lot of responsibility if you're listening to this, and you're having to put on masks left, right, and centre for students, for parental meetings, for other staff, in front of other senior leaders. So it's a moment there as well for you to check in with yourself and not see this as, this is something that I need to do for the benefit of other people. It's something that I do for other people and also myself, so that all of us can continue working in this profession that we all love and we don't want to get out of. It's trying to just make it more human. That's all this is at the end of the day.
Yeah. Someone said to me the other day, they were really struggling in their role as a teacher and everything. And I said, you do know that your head teacher is a human? And they sort of sat back as if that was a complete revelation to them, because I think sometimes there just isn't that relationship and that trusting sort of atmosphere in the school. And so that's huge. Thanks, Billy. I want to ask, so for people, what would be a really big, helpful strategy? What can people do? What would be your big takeaway?
Yeah, just picking one. I think
Maybe
with
two.
a lot of, yeah, I think with a lot of this, if we link it back to the burnout that I was experiencing before, and because what I'd done is I'd reduced myself down to a very mechanical way of viewing the world, as the world is, given that I'm a teacher, a place where I can either teach or sort of poorly recover from teaching and then get back into teaching, and that's it. So the world is either a classroom or not a classroom, not a classroom. And that's how I'd separated the entire world. And in doing that, I reduced myself enormously. So I forgot essentially who I was and what made me feel alive and what made me feel like this dynamic person that has something legitimate to offer to these students. So to make this as practical as possible, one thing that I'd love to have been able to tell myself years ago, because my life has shifted enormously since doing this, is uncovering values work. And that might mean something to some people. I'm happy to briefly explain it. But when we talk about values, it's understanding exactly what it is about you, which if you were to remove that particular trait or that characteristic, something fundamentally would be missing from who you are. So, for example, if you take a creative person and you remove that creativity from that person, something seems to have been irretrievably lost from them, because creativity is a value that they embody so much that they're essentially inseparable. Like, to see that person is to see a vessel of creativity. So one thing that is particularly useful, just to talk people through a really, really basic exercise they could do, like right now with no equipment, it'll only take 10, 20 seconds as well, would be you could just go on Google and find like a list of values and just have a little skim over them and just see which ones feel intuitively right for you. Which ones, if you skim over them, if we look at things like adventurousness or balance or physical fitness or financial security, all of these are examples of values, and some of them will have a real impact and you'll be able to feel it in your body. And some of them will just be words that might sound quite nice, but they don't mean anything to you. What you want to do is filter out the ones that have like this resonance with you overall. And if you can do that to quite a few of these words, let's say narrowing it down to around a top 10, if you could then narrow that down to a top 3 overall, then it becomes really important then to make it really, really clear and specify what those values mean to you. More specifically, how you can actually embody them. What are you physically going to do about it? Because then all of a sudden, if we go back to this idea of boundaries, we then know how to act. It's much more motivating. So if I take in my personal life at the minute, given that I'm outside of the classroom and I'm doing a lot of work with clients, financial security is absolutely big driver for me at this point in time. I need to be very financially safe in myself so that I can act in a more genuine way. But at the same time, I do pride myself on how physically fit I am, because I love the process of becoming fitter and fitter, whether that's going in the gym, whether it's running, whether it's sprinting, whatever else it might be. So straight away there, we've got 2 values of physical fitness and financial security. So if I didn't know what else to do this week coming up or this weekend, as long as I was hitting those 2 areas in one way or another, then I'm going to be happy and flourishing and at least living a meaningful life, because it's in line with who I want to become in the future. But inevitably, there's going to come a point where they they sort of have a bit of tension. So if, let's say, for example, I've got a client booked in at 9 a.m., but I also want to do park run at 9 a.m., I can't do both of them at the same time. I don't think the client would be happy if I did the call when I was doing the run. So I'm just going to assume that's not the case. So if there's going to be a tension there, sometimes the client's going to win out and I'm going to prioritize security. Sometimes fitness is going to win out. But in that case there, when I put them together and I sort of clash them against each other, it becomes really clear of, okay, basically, no matter what happens here, I'm going to win because both of these are in line with who I want to become. And it might just be sometimes this happens, sometimes that happens. And I need to be a bit more open to this spontaneity and this creativity of the fact that life isn't always yes, no, this thing wins, this thing loses. And that was the mindset that I was in when I was burning out as a teacher. It was, you're either on the top of your game, an outstanding teacher in all lessons, or you're a failure, is how my body and my mind interpreted teaching.
Wow.
And rather than it being some lessons are outstanding, some are good, some are outstanding, then you get a load of goods in a row. I tried to make sure good was at least a baseline as a minimum. I'm not going to say that I had poor lessons thrown in. I wanted to make sure good was a minimum. But at the very least then, that would have given me so much more breathing room. In the same way now, if I can sometimes act towards fitness, sometimes to be more creative, sometimes to be more financially secure, it just gives me freedom in how I can act rather than one set way that I can just either succeed at or fail at, and that's it.
Yeah.
So I hope that is just a little short exercise of just find 10 values that are important to you, narrow them down to 3, define exactly what you mean and how you're going to get those 3 values, and what can you do this week to be able to actually act on those values. That'll at least get you in touch with who you are and who you want to be. And then we can start to, with that foot in the door, sort of work out how that can fit in with your teaching life as well. But it can't be lost.
No, I love that, because I was talking to a teacher recently and they were completely overwhelmed, and they are an outstanding teacher in a very challenging school in London. And they were just saying, I am overwhelmed. And, you know, I was saying, what's the bit about your job that you love the most? And they said, it's all the preparation, because they are so creative. And they said, it's the preparation to make it a beautiful lesson for their students. And so we looked at that, and then so we said, what about if you say one lesson a day you are going to present as really beautifully creative? It's going to be the best you can do, and the rest of the lessons are going to be good, but you're going to accept that they're not all going to be your most creative genius, because they couldn't do it. You know, I don't know, as a secondary teacher, how many lessons you teach a day, but that is a lot. So they then reckoned that they would rotate which class would get their creative genius each day, rotated it round, and found that actually that was enough of their creative value being exhibited and fulfilled in them. And they were still good, really good, but it enabled all the lessons to be good, rather than, as you were describing, Billy, of this drained, sort of burnt out, sort of shell of a person who just then can't do anything well.
But that's it. And if I could plan the most perfect lesson as a PowerPoint, but if I'm not there energetically, then they've just got one person in the front of the room who is just reading through a PowerPoint. And no matter how beautiful, the children aren't going to care as much about that, to the point where one thing that I used to do quite often, it all came about by accident, because the power went out in a school once. So we had no electricity. But I loved the fact that then that forced me to literally just use a whiteboard. All I had to go off was a title, the learning objective, and in my head, like the 3 outcomes that I wanted to hit. And all of a sudden, then all you got to do is draw up on the whiteboard, bit by bit, piece together the lesson in the moment. And there's a lot of adaptability there, because you're checking for the feedback from every individual student of, is this actually making sense? Because if we're relying on a PowerPoint a bit too much, it could be you can just draw their attention back to it. Yeah. Whereas if that's not there as a resource, it forces like the individual concentration on every individual person. And now in client work, whether I do this as groups or whether I do it as one-on-one, I'm constantly looking out for like the body language, all the non-physical cues that are happening, like the little slightly scrunched face if somebody doesn't quite understand a point, and then realizing I'm not just going to plow on. I need to stop, and I need to make sure that that's actually understood. It's much easier done in a smaller group or one-on-one compared to a big classroom. But sometimes there can be, that over-reliance on maybe what we prepared beforehand. If energetically we're not there to deliver it in the same way that we created it, there's going to be a mismatch. So my focus is always down to not the technique or anything else like that. It's who is the person in front of the classroom, because it takes real courage to teach. And I want to remind people of that as well, that you've got a living, dynamic human person in front of them who isn't a teacher. It's a person who's experiencing what it's like to be a teacher. And if we can start to separate that person from just the achievements and actually realize, there's a real human here, that's the only way I can see teaching surviving in any meaningful way in the future.
Wow. So Billy, you basically said to all the teachers and leaders who are listening here, remember, you are human and you matter and you have value. And it's about looking at what your even maybe 3 core values are. And are these turning up in your day-to-day life to make you be able to be the best version of you? Oh, Billy, I love all of that. Thank you so much. If people want to find out more about you, where can they find you?
Yeah, sure. So probably LinkedIn is going to be the best place at this point in time. That's where I seem to be most active. So you can just type in either Billy Clark on there, or I'm on Instagram and on YouTube as well as Mr. Clark's Classroom.
Okay, brilliant.
So it'll either be Mr. Clark's Classroom or Mr. Clark's Library.
Okay, we'll put the links in the blurb, Billy, so people can come and find more about you, because you've obviously got a lot of wisdom to impart to lots of teachers and leaders. So I appreciate your time, Billy. That's amazing. Thank you so much.
Not a problem. If there's any teacher listening out to this who is experiencing a bit of overwhelm or a bit of burnout and who wants a confidential one-on-one conversation because they are struggling, please reach out to me. If you're thinking, oh, but I can't afford coaching, reach out to me anyway. I want to be able to speak to you, because teaching is very, very close to my heart. I'm still a teacher, just not in the way that I was for 8 years. So I'm still on the exact same path. I've just taken an alternative route. So if anyone was listening to this and is struggling or wants to enjoy their practice even more, please reach out, and I will happily talk to you without a question.
Thanks, Billy. Love that. All right. Well, bye for now. It's great to have had this chat.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. I hope you took something of value from today. If you want to connect, I'm at rowenahicks.com, or I have a Facebook group, which is Preventing Teacher Burnout. So I look forward to connecting to you at one of those.